Manual gearboxes are dying, but Toyota wants to bring them back, but in a slightly different way. We all thought that electric cars would be the final nail in the manual gearbox's coffin. However, Toyota has filed a patent to fit EVs with a gear stick and a clutch. And no, it's not a clever security measure for the American market. They actually want to make it happen. And yes, we think it's an interesting idea, but we don't think it's going to catch on. Automatic gearboxes have been taking over for a long time, and particularly in the US. Unfortunately, the majority of people see driving as a chore, so an auto box just makes more sense. So if automatic gearboxes really are taking over, and they are, why on earth do Toyota want to shoehorn a shifter and a clutch into electric cars? So how will it work? Well, there will be a shifter, a clutch, a gauge to display what gear you're in, and even a combustion engine-like torque curve. The only problem is, it's not an actual gearbox. It's all fake. It's just one big simulation. Whilst you'd have all the control points of a manual gearbox, they won't be connected to anything. Well, not mechanically anyway. It does make you wonder how it would actually feel. While a manual gearbox can add more fun to a driving experience, there's still such a thing as a bad manual gearbox. Cars from manufacturers like Porsche, Lotus and Mazda are famed for having a manual shift that really adds something to the driving experience. But no one is crying out for the soft and lifeless shift of a Daewoo Matiz. You hear people whining about the switch from hydraulic power steering to electric and how it lacks the sense of connection with the road. So will this feel like an arcade racing game, or will they actually put some effort into making it feel like a proper mechanical shift? It'll be really interesting to see how they make it look and feel. Not to degrade simulators, racing simulators, because you can actually have a lot of fun and learn a lot from driving a simulated car. But that's not what people enjoy about real H-pattern cars. Surely. Toyota really needs to make this feel like a manual car. Imagine trying to drive a manual without the vibrations from the engine, or without hearing the revs climb and fall. As a driver, you can sometimes forget how much you actually rely on all of this input. The patent also says that it will be able to simulate a torque curve to give the impression of driving something with a combustion engine. So none of the instant torque that EVs are known for. Instead, that power will be linear and spread across the rev range. Seems all a bit weird, really. It will also be switchable. So if you're stuck in traffic, parking, or just bored of changing gear, you can switch back to full auto mode, and it'll be like driving a regular EV. You can also choose to use both the clutch and the shifter, or just the shifter on its own. And while that does sound like a reasonably good idea, it will all come down to how it actually feels. Toyota really needs to make it feel real enough to be worth using, so it doesn't end up just being a novelty. Changing gear in a good old regular manual car gives you a variety of sounds and feelings. You've got the weight and the biting point of the clutch, the mechanical noise and feeling of switching cogs, rev matching, the change of engine note as you go through the revs and go for another gear, and so much more. These are all things that are very hard to simulate. And I guess one of the questions is, will it have all the pitfalls included with a manual gearbox? Can you stall this weird gearbox? Will you be able to miss a gear? What will happen if you shift into first at 80 miles an hour? Will it simulate smashing the valves and leave you with 6 neutrals? Well, that's probably a bit too far. But in all seriousness, it has to feel enjoyable enough to actually want to choose it over the instant power from the very good EV motor. There's another issue as well. Manual gearbox sales are dying, so are there enough people out there to actually want this? More and more people are buying automatics. Last year in the UK, 56% of cars sold were autos, up from 35% in 2016 and around 15% in 2010. And how many of those people would actually want the option to drive in a manual mode in an EV? A lot of those that still want to change gear themselves are car enthusiasts, but nowadays most performance cars come with some form of automatic box. The Corvette has always been available with a manual, but the most recent C8 model will only be available with a dual clutch transmission. So why is that? Well, we've heard it a million times now, that manufacturers won't have a manual option because not enough people buy them. The Corvette is a prime example of that. Corvette's previous generation manual option dwindled from 50% of the sales to around 20% by the time production stopped. As sad as that is, if people aren't ticking that manual gearbox option, then there's not much reason to keep it. Companies like Toyota and Porsche have stuck with the manual gearbox option in some of their more enthusiast-focused cars because their sales figures make it worthwhile. Take the last generation of the 911 GT3 for example. Whilst all its rivals are predominantly auto only, the GT3 was still offered with the option of a manual box. Surprisingly, around 70% of the GT3s sold in the US came with a stick and 3 pedals compared to around 20% for the rest of the 911 range. But despite that, performance cars with a stick and 3 pedals are nowhere near as common as they used to be. But there are definitely some positives. After all, it's literally there to give electric cars a bit more fun and driver involvement, and that's definitely no bad thing. Maybe this is a feature most electric cars could use for driving in slippery conditions like snow. Surely having more control over power delivery will make pulling away in icy conditions a little bit more manageable. A lot of modern cars have electronic throttles that are mapped to be more or less responsive in certain modes, so perhaps simulated manuals would just work similar to that. Granted, it's not quite the same, but most autos have the option of changing gears with pedals, so perhaps it's not that strange to have a shifter instead. There is an aftermarket company which has already built a manual EV. Electrogenic converts everything from Beetles to Rolls-Royces into EVs. Their Porsche 356 uses the original 4-speed gearbox that still features the standard pressure plate and clutch. It even has an air-cooled battery pack. This is super interesting. The electric motor is linked to a top hat which connects it to the flywheel, which makes it feel as authentic as possible. The motor only produces 120 brake horsepower and 173 pounds-foot of torque to prevent the gearbox from, well, imploding. Is that better than Toyota's idea, or is it only fit for converted classics like the 356? Well, it's only a patent right now, so who knows how this will turn out. We're just glad some manufacturers still want to make their cars as fun as possible. If you like this video, then check out this other video, which I think you'll love. Thanks for watching, be sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.